So in the description for my talk, I know when Claudia asked me to join the series, I proposed something that I think sounds very ambitious, that I'll be discussing the visual representation of indigenous forms of medical treatment in manuscript and print culture after the fall of Tenochtitlan through the first years of the 18th century. And indeed, in 40 minutes, I don't think that I can do that. And so instead, I'm actually going to try to bring you into moments or use visual culture to provoke certain questions, without any aim of being comprehensive. At the same time, I've organized my remarks in such a way that I imagine that at least some of you are more familiar with certain kinds of representations than others. So instead of, there are moments where I will point towards work done by colleagues, not to say that it's not important, but rather there's more scholarship there, and try to spend more of the 40 minutes that I'll be talking, introducing you to images that perhaps are less familiar. So illustrating medical treatment in colonial America, I wanted to start simply by saying that there's, of course, a great divide between visual culture and verbal representations that you're going to have about the New World, and that indeed some of the most interesting representations that we have about indigenous medical practice are not going to be illustrated, right? What I will argue is that this absence of illustrations that you're going to have regarding in the practices of indigenous peoples is going to become a spectral presence in some of the later images that you are actually going to see towards the end of the 16th century and going into the 17th century. But I wanted to begin with this section. It's a passage from Fray Ramon Panez, Relación acerca de las antigüedades de los indios, which was finished around 1498, because it is one of the texts that has what I would argue one of the earliest representations or concerns directly medical practice in the Americas. Now you're going to have some threads of information perhaps in other Colombian sources before, but it is really with Panez that then you have a concern about indigenous medicine. However, it's a negative description of indigenous medicine. Panez, when he's describing indigenous belief system, interestingly, he is more careful, less judgmental, and yet when it comes to medicine, he has 3 chapters that are strictly directly concerned, with full descriptions of these procedures. So he talks about the figure of the Beique in Taino culture, and I wanted to read with you this just to foreground my talk. When Beiques visit a patient, Panez says, before leaving, he takes some soot from a cooking pot or ground charcoal and blackens his face in order to make the sick man believe whatever he may say about his sickness. Then he takes some small bones and a little meat, and wrapping the whole thing in something so that they stay together, he puts it in, oh, that's a typo, sorry. They put it in their mouths. When the doctor enters the sick man's hut, he sits down and all fall silent. If there are any children in the hut, they are sent away so they will not interfere with the Beique's work. And only 1 or 2 of the principal men remain. Then the Beique takes some huello herbs, white and another herb wrapped in onion leaf 4 inches long, and taking it between his hands, he mashes it into a pulp. They put it in their mouths at night so as to vomit what they have eaten so it does not harm them. Then they begin to sing and chant, and lighting up a torch, they drink the juice of that herb. This done, he is quiet for a time. He then rises, goes towards a sick man who lies alone in the middle of the hut, and walks about him twice as he thinks proper. Then he stands in front of him and takes him by the legs, touching his body from the thighs to the feet, after which he draws his hands away forcefully as if pulling something out. Then he goes to the door, shuts it, and speaks to it, saying, "Be gone to the mountain or the sea, or where, or will you will it?" After he has blown like the one who blows chaff from his hand, he turns around, joins his hands together as if he were very cold, blows on his hands, and sucks in his breath as if sucking marrow from a bone, and then sucks at the sick man's neck or stomach or shoulder or cheeks or belly or some other part of the body. Having done this, he begins to cough and make a face as if he had eaten something bitter. Then he spits into his hand the stone or bone or piece of meat that he has put in his mouth at home or on the road. And it is a piece of food, he tells the sick man, "You must know that you have eaten something that caused the sickness from which you suffer. See how I have taken it out of your body, where your semi, the deity that he's identifies as worshiping, lodged it because you did not pray to him or build him a shrine or give him some land." Now, I've taken the time to read this quote in full because what strikes me about it is that it's such an early testimony. It's 1498, and yet we're going to see iterations or a return, particularly in visual representations that you have very late, all the way into the 19th century, of this emblematic scene. You know, it's going to be staged in Tevez, no, when he's going to be describing Brazil. It's going to then become this errant topic, you know, of this representation of sort of contact with the body, this involving of sucking out an illness. And then, you know, I mentioned, or Claudia mentioned that I also work in visual culture. It's interesting to me too, how it then becomes in 20th century cinema, also a scene that is recognizable, you know, in films that try to go back to the colonial period, right? So to think about the kinds of images, no, and I mentioned in the description that I provided that part of what interests me about this period is that there's a range of responses, and so you'll see that visual culture, in some way, in my opinion, augments certain possibilities and hides others. Now, in the case of Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, you're going to have a description, a very strong interest in the description of natural products from the New World. And it's curious that in more following the logic of natural history rather than medicinal history, at some points he's going to talk about medicine, but not always. And so even at times when he's describing some natural products that in other sources are going to be discussed in the context of medical applications, Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo does that in some cases, but not in others. One case in which he does do that, and it's a plant that then seems to interest him particularly because it also offers a drawing, is this one, no? The Coigaraca herb is so singular and well known in these our Indies that the Indians regard them highly for sores and even old ones because it eats away and removes rotting flesh. And if they cure themselves easily, which is a marvelous thing and self-evident medicine. Notice also this idea of something being self-evident as opposed to requiring investigation. So there's a sort of a double impetus here. One of acknowledging a process of something that he finds absolutely marvelous, but at the same time taking away the novelty or the process behind it. So that tension, I see it in this description. They take the herb and place it close to the fire so that it dries, or they set it aside after cutting it so that it wilts, and they put it over the sore without doing anything else, sin hacer otra diligencia alguna, which again goes in that direction. And it has a caustic effect, but better and no sublimate equals it. And what one puts on the sore is the outside part of the leaf, which is not as green as the color as the inside. So even though he has said that it is something self-evident, then he goes on into a description that actually goes into the particulars of how this plant is going to be used. So it's sort of working in both directions at the same time. So you have sources like, and you'll notice that I'm also going to be going roughly, chronologically to try to point, to organize my talk in a way that makes sense. And so with a source like Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, early chroniclers, you're also going to then have other kinds of documents that are leaving a testimony of the process, not only the value of indigenous medicine and showing the curiosity of Europeans towards indigenous medicine. And here I'm speaking, I've moved from the Caribbean to New Spain. So there's that interest in capturing information. And at the same time, there's going to be a negotiation between codes. This, as many of you I'm sure recognize, is the Libellus, the Vadianus Codex, which was dictated by Martín de la Cruz, a Nahua elder, to Juan Badiano, one of the students at the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco, still circa 1552. What's interesting about this document, I mean, many things that are interesting about this document, and you notice that there's not only the visual element and also the standing out of Nahua terms, but then the description is in Latin, and this particular one also the style, if you will, and the manner in which these things are narrated. When sleep is interrupted, the Tlatzopatli herb is used to attract it and maintain it, which grows close to anthills, along with Cochitzhuithuil, mixed with swallow's gall, finely ground and applied to the forehead. In addition, juice squeezed from the leaves of a little herb called Huihuitzio Cochiltzictzuilt, and you will forgive my atrocious pronunciation of Nahuatl, should be applied to the entire body. So the trend going to portray natural products is also going to shift, right? Because you have here the interest in showing the ants is not decorative, but rather to be practical, so that you are also maintaining that a point of reference. But I would like to have you, or I would have you notice the fact that this is a document from 1552, and yet if you compare it to the copy that is made once this document, which is organized by the viceroy to be sent to the King of Spain, there's no evidence that it was actually read by him, and then it comes, it's similar to the fate that you have with Hernandez's manuscripts. It's going to end in Italy. Then you have a document or a copy that, even though we are in 1627, so almost a century later, the interest or the respect, if you will, in transcribing not just the plants, but also the process of how to use them. I find it striking, if anything, because it's not representative of other modes of appropriating this material in European sources. And I'm referring here to Nicolás Monardes, and I'll try to say more about that towards the end of the talk. But the idea of divorcing the plant and the usefulness of the ingredient from the process that's described as a cultural indigenous practice is not a trend that seems to be followed here, even if the copy that is made is definitely very much abridged and selected, compared to the full extent of the Badianus Codex. Another source, if we're thinking about illustrations, and this is the one case that I referred to at the start of my talk, where if anything, it probably would be the source that would be key in order to address this question, but it's also the one that has the most bibliography. Bernardino de Sahagún and the Florentine Codex, which has a number of descriptions and illustrations also of indigenous practice and indigenous modes of approach to illness. One of the things that's interesting about the Florentine Codex in comparison to the Badianus Codex is that there's a very clear negotiation necessary in the Florentine Codex in terms of an indigenous perspective with current events, not only because it addresses epidemics that are ravaging Mexico at the time, but it also introduces a reading of European humoral medicine. And so, for example, compared to the Badianus Codex, where there's no considerations of things like hot and cold when you're describing, even though they're being coded in Latin, that doesn't seem to be a negotiation here. The Florentine Codex does go in that direction, and so it has, it shows an indigenous medicine that is not, and this is important, I think, in the overall tenor of my remarks. Indigenous agency is not something that's frozen in time. Even if visual culture is going to push towards a reading that freezes indigenous agency as if it were not capable of interacting or interpreting or absorbing European information, the Florentine Codex very early on doesn't take that route, and it seems to be working in both directions. Now, as it regards print culture, and this is where I wanted, it focuses more closely on things that I've studied in my book. And as it regards print culture in particular, to compare, okay, so we're looking about visual illustrations in medical sources. The panorama, if we look at materials, European materials, including materials being printed in Spain compared to the New World, there's going to be a big difference. So even though the New World, when we know from Irving Leonard's work, the readers of the New World are avid consumers of imported volumes of materials coming in from Europe, and among subjects pertaining to science, medicine seems to be a preferred subject. There's going to be a disparity here in terms of the technological ability to produce things like, for example, Vesalius's Fabrica. And so increasingly, when we go through the 16th century, there's going to be a disconnect, perhaps, or a different pace of evolution, where you will have a very robust engagement with sometimes cutting edge materials. Very quick readings, that things published in Madrid are being critiqued in Mexico, sometimes 2 years after they appear. So there's a demonstration, particularly towards the end of the century, of a very sophisticated engagement and critique with contemporary sources. The visual representations that you have are not going to go in that direction. However, I would argue that they do something else, no, and that they appeal to a practical nature that if we forego no, the strictly be dazzled by the technological difference in terms of the techniques that are being used to illustrate books, it might be that we arrive at a different appreciation of these materials. So I'm going to go chronologically and show you basically what images are here and sort of to try to tell the story of that evolution in a snapshot of this much larger story. So the first medical book, proper printed, a European medical book printed in the New World, Bravo's Opera Medicinalia. The kinds of approaches that you have to illustrations here are readings of previous European approaches. Now, this is, if you notice, it's an image that is, it's quite clearly doing the common practice of asking somebody to then, if you don't have access to the plates and you can then use the plates again, then you try to make a copy. But of course, in making that copy in order to make the plates, then the image is reversed. And so here, if you compare Bravos's image to Vesalius's image, you'll notice that Bravos's image is incorrect because it puts the vena cava on the other side. I should say that this has been known but for some time, but if you're interested in this particular subject, Scarab published a book in 2016 where he analyzes this image in further detail. So that idea of incorporating or being in touch with European medicine, perhaps, no, but at the same time, I'm sorry, I thought that I had put images of that, but I didn't. He also includes two botanical illustrations of materials in the New World, that are then new illustrations of botanical plants added to the book. And so it's going to have both a reading of European sources and also trying to code American nature using European codes. From Bravos's Opera Medicinalia, which if you notice in the series that I showed, it's the only book that is also going to be in Latin. No other books are going to use Latin or turn to Latin, but are going to be written in Castilian. That idea of going back and forth is also evident in then what is the first medical book proper printed in a Romance language in the Americas, which is Alonso López Hinojoso, Suma Recopilación de Cirugía from 1578, which doesn't have any medical illustrations inside. And even though he was a nurse practitioner at the Hospital de Indios. And so, and I've explored this more in greater length in the book, there's a way in which my reading of Alonso López Hinojoso's work, to imagine that that work outside of an indigenous context is very difficult, given that so much of his involvement with patients was in direct contact with indigenous people. And if you read closely, there's also evidence of having engaged in medical treatment with African populations. And so it's a book that has been perhaps misread as a source that is very European, quote unquote, and yet the very fact that it is a source being produced in Castilian by somebody who lacked university training that perhaps would not have even been published in the context of, had he been in Spain, already makes it into a book worth considering separately, for an American book in other ways. And here simply to showcase the very, it's hard to say, and I guess our historians would have more to say about that, but there's clearly a debt here to either this image or perhaps an intermediary image between the two. And you can see that there's elements here of the representation of Cosmas and Damien, the medicine box, the urine flask, the folds of the cloth, the ermine coat. So there are different elements here that are being repeated, similar to the image that I showed you before of the heart. Now, another book that I include in the series that I think then, I consider an American book because his author, Pedro Arias de Benavides, made his career in the New World to then go back to Valladolid and publish this text. So it's a book that is about American experiences and is going to foreground a mode of enunciation that then is key to some of the other books that follow, particularly in a sense of feeling excluded and of complaining about the monopoly that Seville was, that he saw Seville had in speaking about and speaking for the New World. This book I find very interesting because it does two things. One, it's going to include medical images in a way that is followed in the New World. And there is evidence that this book, even though it's published in Spain, was of interest to people in Mexico who then purchased it. So there's evidence of it appearing in book orders. And it's also going to go in that different direction of telling you about indigenous practice in a positive way. And this is from a section where he's talking about a fellow colleague, but his solidarity doesn't seem to lie with his colleague, no? A very famous doctor who went there from Spain fell ill with this illness of dysentery, and he was so arrogant and pleased with his own ability that even before arriving in Mexico, while still in Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is 1 league away from Mexico City, he began to threaten doctors and surgeons. When he arrived in the Indies, he ate many bad local fruits and fell ill with choleric dysentery. And trusting his own ability, as I have said, though some local doctors advised him of what he should do and certified to him the customary progression of that illness in that land, he responded, "Begone your lordships with God," accusing them of wanting to kill him. And he's actually more direct in the Spanish. The Spanish switches into the first person, to actually dramatize that utterance. And he prepared a bath with cold water up to his stomach, and being so frail, he died in it and was left full of his medicines and remedies because he did not wish to employ the ones that were used in the land. Part of what's curious here is this idea of the médicos de la tierra, so where I translate as local doctors, this phrase of de la tierra, and the way that it functions in the book and the way that it functions actually in some other, in other sources of the period, addresses or tries to point towards an indigenous identity, a local identity that is not local understood as Creole or as multi ethnic. And so there's moments in this text where there's going to be a very clear positive appraisal of not just a particular indigenous plant or a product, but there's also here a recognition of a certain level that is at odds with what you find in Fernandez de Oviedo, or even what you find, of course, in Panez. Now, I mentioned that this book has that, and then also has this approach to images, right? And so the images in this book, which might seem perhaps unimpressive at first glance. You have here a tau that is being explained as in the context of a method to make incisions. Then you're going to have an instrument of his own design that is used for cutting off circulation to veins in the eye. And I should point out perhaps that this is in 1567. So the famous treatise on ophthalmologies that are going to then be published in Europe, lavishly illustrated, with all sorts of examples. This obviously doesn't go in that direction, nor is it entirely focused on ophthalmology, but ophthalmia, so that particular illness that had to do with an inflammation of the eye, is acknowledged early on in the title of the text, and he's providing a tool that would have been regarded as very innovative, in the context of the time. And the other image that you have here is a circle that then you have to draw a certain number of times. And if you take the time to read the section here in the quote, the idea is to take this and then you have to draw this image 3 times, and it says exactly of the size indicated in this book. And so the image here, part of what I find interesting is that it actually turns into a medical instrument. The text tells you that you are to place this image next to your patient so that you can draw this, repeat this figure a number of times and then use it as a guide for your incision. So in some ways, if you compare this kind of approach, it's on the page, it's difficult perhaps to sort of see its potential, and yet thanks to the intervention of a period reader from the copy of this book at the British Library, in a different section where he's not talking about the same procedure that he had described early on in 136b, but he also mentions in passing that this tool that he had mentioned before can also be used, a tool that it would be the size indicated on the page, so a very small instrument meant to be used in the eye, that it can also be used for something else. The reader of this copy has gone in and drawn the instrument in to size as well. So the idea that you're using an instrument in a way, again, an image that then becomes an instrument, and there's hard to tell. And then, of course, if somebody actually makes the instrument from the information, that part I can't speak to. But at least there's evidence of a use of the image that goes beyond either the decorative or the referential. So compared to something like Andreas Vesalius and the illustration of these instruments, true, the level of detail that you're going to have or the variety in the description of tools is going to be quite different. Arias de Benavides mentions other tools and other processes that are not illustrated, and yet there's a practicality to the approach that should be acknowledged. And again, it's a kind of practicality, and the case studies that he puts in his book transpire in the New World. No, and he lived in present-day Dominican Republic and also in Mexico. And so the American experience and his approach to visual illustration, I think, make him part of this larger story. And again, that kind of approach is then arguably maintained. No, so the first, even though it seems perhaps not super impressive, but in the next book that we have following the dates, there's an anatomical image here that is easy to miss. No, so it's this tiny illustration, also interestingly pertaining to structures in the eye. So there's an interest again, on that kind of medicine and visual illustrations going in that direction. And in the case of Agustín Farfal's Tratado Breve from 1579, so published just 1 year after López de Hinojoso's, you're going to have taus are going to be used in a decorative way, but what's interesting to me is that they're also going to be used again as points of reference to tell the surgeon the shape in which he is to make a particular incision. And so there's also a way of taking an image that might function alphabetically almost, or in a way that's unremarkable, and then turning it into something that is a medical image. Farfán, like López de Hinojoso's, also is writing in the context of New Spain, but interestingly, in the case of Agustín Farfán, particularly going towards the second edition, there's going to be a positive appreciation of Aztec medicine and a very self-conscious plea or recommendation to his readers to make use of the tianguis of Mexico City in order to be able to access medicines. So there's again a positive appreciation of indigenous medicine, even if the book is organized in a way that is comprehensive, in the same shape that you would expect of an anatomical treatise in a European context. And one of the last images in the series that I wanted to show you, because I'm cognizant of time, is this image in the second edition of Alonso López de Hinojoso. So going from that reversed image of Cosmas and Damien in this second edition, and this is an image that many of you, I imagine, have seen, there's this illustration of the intestines, which suggests all sorts of questions. The reason why he explains that this image is necessary, he claims, is that since his book is for people who are not in Mexico City, but that are perhaps further away from centers of knowledge. Therefore, this image might be useful, but it's an unsatisfactory explanation as to exactly how it's going to be of use in surgical practice. Now, he was very concerned with processes of digestion, even engaged in what we would call today medical experimentation. He had access to condemned men and did experiments feeding them food to try to track the passage of food going down through the stomach and into the intestines. And again, the question that I ask in my own work with this image that I think is pertinent is his place of employment. If he had ample contact with indigenous people and he built his practice at the Hospital de Indios, then what does that say about, illustrating indigenous medicine, but also the sort of spectral illustration of indigenous bodies that haunts some of these images is there as an open question. Now, part of what I think that then needs to be foregrounded so what about this then, that these books that are taking the place, they have limited amount of medical illustration. Again, there's a sort of erosion in the interest in narrating indigenous practices or curative practices, and yet there is a renewed and constant and increasing interest in medicinal products for to be imported into Europe. And so this divorce between practice and product is going to be very pertinent, and then associated perhaps with the closing of spaces of enunciation, not just for indigenous voices, but also for the Europeans that are writing about medicine in the context of Mexico, and then find that their work is not resonating, not altering the course of research of these products. No? So one example that I think is paradigmatic is the case of Monardes, an incredibly successful and very influential source in the context of European medicine. But what's different in Monardes, if you compare this image, and the image to the left from 1574, even though Monardes is going to be he's going to be very appreciative of American medicine. He's going to argue that his contribution, or the treasure that America has to offer the world in medicine, is going to surpass any other treasures that Europe thinks that it can gain from the New World. There's going to be an interventionist and revelatory approach to the description of American medicine. So his description of tobacco, even though in practice, the kinds of procedures that he's describing overlap with earlier accounts that we have of indigenous uses of the product, there's a lack of recognition or acknowledgement that there is that debt there. Now, to the point that in one of the subsequent editions, 74 edition of Monardes, there's going to be a purported letter from this gentleman from Peru, in which this gentleman from Peru thanks Monardes profusely for finally being able to reveal and unlock the secrets of American medicine, which would be otherwise unintelligible from a local point of view. And so increasingly the image and the product, and if you think about this issue, not just in terms of visual culture, but in terms of pharmaceuticals, even in the present day, that division then becomes augmented by the course of the choice of illustrations that you have of American medicine. And I think that the image that I showed, there's going to be a gap or a lack of interest. So an interest in portraying indigenous practices. Increasingly, it's not going to be indigenous practices that are part of the urban milieu of the city. And so even though, of course, there's going to be the interest perhaps in American medicine and the figure of the doctor, you see it in somebody like Juan del Valle Caviedes, and so you're going to have the figure of the doctor reference. Part of what I find is that when there are descriptions of indigenous practices, the context has shifted from it being a model, like you had in the case of the Vadianos Codex, of something to follow and then to tease out and incorporate, and more as a sort of curiosity, so a practice that is fanciful, and fanciful in a way that becomes quite ironic. So this one, from a New Voyage and Description of the Isthmus of America, has this fanciful presentation of bloodletting, which has then shifted a practice that is all over the materials that I discussed with you as something that is accepted and recommended, and then projected now onto a figure of an indigenous person. Again, not the same representation of indigeneity, but a preference for representing the kind of indigeneity that you see perhaps on the right rather than on the left. So again, conceptualizing the indigenous figure as a figure outside of time, outside of a dialogue or an intervention, a conversation with science. And then even though it's the kind, what the repercussions for that also in terms of obscuring the possibility of participation on the part of indigenous people, because as we will remember, at least in the case of the University of Mexico, when the University of Mexico was founded in the mid-16th century, there was an interest, or the charter originally proposed that it would be a university open to the sons of principal people, of indigenous people, and also of people of Europe, which was then not enforced. But in the 17th century, when indigenous people once again challenge that normative, they go back to the original declaration and use it as making their case for the inclusion in that university setting. But instead, what you're going to have are representations, particularly as we move forward in the 19th century, going back, or an interest in these very early representations of indigenous medicine. Now it's almost as if the early 16th century then becomes a privileged way of seeing indigenous people elsewhere. Now this one is from the Wellcome collection, and it's describing a practice that is also impane, that if the medical procedure was not successful, the family would then beat up the beique, because he was unable to cure the patient. So that episode that you have from the late 15th century is then illustrated. It becomes, now it's not in the Caribbean, but now it's been moved to Peru. You have just like this one that are imagining again, a 16th century story, this of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, being tended to by two Peruvians, not described as indigenous, but Indian gratitude Peruvians attending Las Casas. But it's a kind of medical attention that doesn't speak of expertise whatsoever. No, it's put in the context of gratitude rather than medical practice. So I know that I've come to the end of my time, but I wanted to go back to an image that, and I was commenting on this before we started recording, trying to find points of continuity between the kind of work that I do with visual culture as somebody who's primarily trained in philology and also, in the history of medicine to an extent, and the other papers or the other interventions that we have in this series. And I wanted to go back to an image that was shown by Akemi. She pointed out, she was trying to, I think, tease out the relationships that you have here between different fields of study and the importance of thinking about Hispanic culture in a transatlantic and dialogic way. And she had remarked that here in this corner, you had El Arte de la Pintura de Pacheco. And I would simply try to, or point out that above these, what you have are, and this Paul of Finland has written very eloquently about this, a reference to Kierkegaard, Athanasius Kierkegaard and their Kyrkeri opera. She argues that this is a game that's being played in the library because as a viewer of the time would recognize, Kierkegaard would fill the entire library, and here it's just this very tiny volume. But I would have you notice that you have here Galen, and you have Hippocrates, and you have a book on surgery, and a book on pharmacy, and a book on anatomy. And anatomy is sharing space with Góngora, who's a pretty important feature in order to author to understand Sor Juana. So as an invitation to, again, I think in the spirit of this series, to try to find points of contact between our different fields and see if then we can lead to answering some pending but urgent questions. Thank you very much.